Welcome back to Inside Vietnam. If you've been watching this channel for any length of time, you know what we do here. We sit down with people who came to this country looking for something, a fresh start, a lower cost of living, a bit of warmth in every sense of the word, and we ask them to tell us honestly what happened. Some of those stories end in disaster. Some end somewhere more complicated than that. Today's story is one of the complicated ones. Declan Murtagh is 47 years old. He's from County Roscommon in the west of Ireland. He spent 22 years as a secondary school geography teacher, the kind of man who has, by professional habit, a very thorough answer for almost every question you might ask him. He came to Vietnam in January of 2025 with a plan, a budget, a spreadsheet, actually, two of them. What Declan didn't have a column for, and this is what makes his story different from a lot of what we cover here, is himself. He's going to tell you what Vietnam actually cost him in 2025. All of it. And I promise you, the number that matters most is not the one you'd expect. Here's his story, in his own words, right. I'll start with the geography teacher thing, because it matters more than it sounds. I spent 22 years explaining the world to other people. Population distribution, trade routes, the economic factors that drive migration, climate systems, resource extraction, post-colonial debt structures. I had a PowerPoint for all of it. I was, and I mean this without any particular pride, quite good at explaining why people end up where they end up. Quite good at explaining why people end up where they end up. I taught at the same school from the age of 25, St. Attracta's Community School, Ballinlow Road, Roscommon Town. Same staff room, same mug with the Connacht rugby crest on it that someone gave me as a Secret Santa in 2009, and that I continued to use not out of affection, but because it had survived 11 years without getting broken. And at a certain point, that feels like a commitment. Same drive down the N61 every morning, same drive back every evening, same roundabout at Circular Road, same parking space if I got there before Mikkel from the science department, which I usually did because Mikkel was chronically late and had been for the entire duration of my career, and probably still is. I don't say this to make it sound miserable. It wasn't, mostly. It was a life. A continuous one, which is a different thing from a happy one. But I didn't really examine that distinction until I had cause to. The cause arrived in June of 2022. I'm not going to spend a long time on this part because it's not the interesting part, and also because some of it still has, as I say to the lads, live wires. My wife Sinietta and I separated. Formally, legally, expensively separated. She got the house, which was in Athlone, a 40-minute drive from the school, which I'd been doing for 19 years without complaint, and which I mention only to give you a sense of the geometry of my existence at that point. She got primary custody of our two kids. Cormac was 14, Ioife was 11. I got a rented room in Roscommon Town, a court order for maintenance, and the ongoing experience of paying a mortgage on a house I was no longer allowed to enter without prior arrangement. The room smelled of damp, and, depending on the evening, of whatever the family above me had made for dinner. For a while, I stopped noticing. Then, one night in November 2023, I noticed again. Specifically, I noticed that it smelled of someone else's shepherd's pie, and that I had been living inside other people's domestic arrangements, passively, for going on 2 years. And that this was, I'm choosing the word carefully, insufficient. So I started watching YouTube, which is, I understand, not a sentence that typically precedes a period of great wisdom. But there you are. It was the cost of living videos that got me first. You know the type. Lad in his 30s, sits in a very clean apartment, slightly too much ring light, tells you he's living in Southeast Asia for €400 a month. I watched about 40 of them over a couple of weeks. I didn't find them inspiring, if I'm being honest. I found them testable. Every time one of them gave a number, I wrote it down. I cross-referenced. I found blogs. I found Facebook groups with names like Expats in Vietnam and Vietnam Cost of Living Real Talk 2024, which I joined under the impression that the words Real Talk meant something. I built a spreadsheet. Column A, categories. Column B, projected monthly costs. It was a good spreadsheet. Vietnam came out ahead of the other places I looked at, and I looked at a lot. Thailand was slightly cheaper, but I'd read enough to know the expat scene. There had a particular character I wasn't sure I was looking for. Portugal was tempting, but I'd done the sums, and the cost of living had risen considerably. And anyway, the weather in Lisbon in January is not dramatically better than Roscommon. Spain. I eliminated almost immediately because Sinaned and I had gone to Lanzarote in 2014 for a package holiday, and I didn't particularly want a whole country to feel like that. Vietnam, by my analysis, made sense. The cost of living matched the videos. The climate was warm. There was an existing expat community, which I noted as potentially useful. And unlike some of the others, it had cities with genuine infrastructure, proper hospitals, reliable internet, a functioning transport network that didn't require me to own a car. The money side of things I should explain, because it's relevant to what comes later. My mother, Bridie, died in April of 2022, 2 months before the separation, as it happens, which is a piece of timing I've thought about more than is probably healthy. She'd had a small life insurance policy, $78,000, which she'd been paying into since the 1980s and which came to me as her only child. I didn't touch it. Not immediately. Spending it felt like a decision I wasn't ready to make. And I think what I mean is it felt like a conversation with her I wasn't ready to have, so it sat in the credit union, accumulating interest at a rate that was frankly an insult to the concept of investment, but sitting there. When I started planning properly, I looked at the full picture. The insurance money. My pension, I'd been able to access a partial early payment at 47 due to a provision related to work-related stress, which I mention because it's accurate, and also because if you'd told me at 25 that work-related stress would become a financial category in my life, I'd have thought you were describing someone else. The partial pension came to roughly $1,100 a month. Not a fortune. Combined with the lump sum, it was, I calculated, enough for a comfortable 5 to 7 years if I was careful. I was planning to be careful. I had a spreadsheet. I told my mate Kieran about the plan on a Thursday evening. Kieran lives in Galway, works in construction, has been telling me to do something drastic since about 2015. I explained my research. I outlined the projected monthly costs. I described it, and I used this exact phrase, as investigating options. There was a silence on the phone. Then Kieran said, "Dec, just go, would ya?" I flew out of Dublin on the 8th of January. Carry-on bag only. I'd read that you could buy everything you needed in Ho Chi Minh City for less than you'd pay at home, which turned out to be mostly true. I had the spreadsheet on my phone. I also had a printed copy, folded into quarters, in the inside pocket of my jacket. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds. Dien Sinant Neat Airport at 6 in the morning is not what the videos prepare you for. It's not bad, exactly. It's just immediate. You walk out through the arrivals hall, and the heat takes hold of you before you've fully decided to be in Vietnam, which is a strange sensation. January in Roscommon is, as a rule, approximately 4 degrees and the color of an old receipt. Ho Chi Minh City in January is 28 degrees and smells of exhaust fumes and something frying that I couldn't identify, and, underneath it all, something floral that I also couldn't identify. And the combination of those things hit me before I'd even found the taxi rank. I'd pre-booked a grab to the guest house where I was staying for the first week while I looked for an apartment. The driver spoke no English and I spoke no Vietnamese, and we communicated entirely through the app map and occasional mutual nods of confirmation, which was fine. It was 25 minutes from the airport to District 7. I watched the city through the window. Here is what the YouTube videos don't convey, the density of it. The motorbikes aren't a background detail, they're the foreground, the midground. And if you're not careful, briefly the vehicle about to remove your wing mirror. They move in a way that looks, from the outside, like complete chaos, but is actually something more like water, finding gaps, filling spaces, operating by a logic you don't have the vocabulary for yet. The power lines overhead are genuinely alarming. Bundles of cables, the thickness of a man's arm running between poles, at angles that suggest no one has ever conducted an audit. I made a note of this not because I was worried. I wasn't particularly, but because it was the first of many things that the videos had somehow managed to make look orderly. The guest house was fine. Clean, air-conditioned, a window that looked into the interior courtyard where someone was cooking something at 6:30 in the morning, and the smell of it coming up was, actually, it was tremendous. Pho, I think, or something close to it. Broth and herbs and something charred. I hadn't eaten since Dublin, and I stood at that window for a solid 2 minutes before going downstairs and gesturing at the pot until the woman there gave me a bowl of it for 40,000 dong, which is about €1.50, and I ate it standing up in the courtyard and thought, all right, the numbers might actually work. And for the first 3 weeks, they did. That's the thing I want to be clear about, because this story is not about Vietnam being more expensive than advertised. Vietnam is genuinely affordable. My mistake was a different kind of mistake, and I'll get to it. I found the apartment in District 7 through a Facebook group. The same one I'd been reading from Roscommon.studio. 1 bedroom, proper bed, functioning air conditioning, a small kitchen. 12th floor of a block about 10 minutes from the Lot Mart on 1.ath. €12 million dong a month. That's roughly €440. The YouTube lad had been right. I signed a 3-month lease and transferred the deposit and sat on the bed in the empty apartment and opened the spreadsheet and entered the first number in column B. It matched column A. I felt, genuinely, like I'd done something competent. The plumbing made a sound at irregular intervals that I can only describe as philosophical. A sort of questioning groan from somewhere behind the bathroom wall that never led to any actual water event, but suggested that water events were being considered. The neighbor 2 floors down had karaoke equipment and the conviction to use it on Thursday evenings. Neither of these things bothered me particularly. I was sleeping 8 hours a night for the first time in 3 years. My actual costs in those early weeks, sing tum tum, broken rice with grilled pork, from the place on the corner, about 45,000 dong, less than €2, café soir from the woman with the cart outside the building, 15,000 dong. Grab bikes for getting around, averaging maybe 50,000 dong a day. A SIM card. A cheap motorbike rental for the weekends when I wanted to go further. The spreadsheet was not just holding, it was performing. I should say, I was happy. Not extravagantly happy. Not the kind of happy that makes you ring people up to tell them. Just the low-level, daily functional happiness of a man who has somewhere to be and things to do, and is not lying awake at 4 in the morning thinking about a house in Athlone. That was new. I noted it the way you'd note a change in barometric pressure. Useful information, potentially significant. The teaching idea came at the end of the second week. I want to be precise about this because I think my imprecision about it at the time was itself informative. I did not need the money. The pension plus the lump sum was sufficient. I told myself I wanted structure, which was true. I told myself it would be useful to have somewhere to go on weekday mornings, which was also true. I found a Facebook recommendation for a language school in Vientiane, an Apollo English franchise, well regarded, looking for part-time native speakers for adult beginner classes. No TEFL required for the introductory level, which suited me since I didn't have one, though I'd been teaching in various capacities for 22 years, and felt reasonably confident I could explain the present tense to an adult who wanted to learn it. I went in on a Tuesday, 3rd week of January. The school was on Yan Tien Tien Huang, 2nd floor above a pharmacy. You could hear the motorbikes from the classroom windows. The reception area had a poster of a young woman looking delighted about the English language, and several plastic chairs and a front desk. Behind the front desk was Lynn. She was processing some kind of paperwork when I came in. She looked up, asked what she could help me with, and I explained I'd come about the part-time teaching inquiry. She found the correct form. She explained the process, trial class observation, short interview with the academic coordinator, paperwork if they wanted to proceed. She was efficient, clear. Her English was careful in a way that you could tell was deliberate rather than uncertain. She was choosing words precisely, not searching for them. At some point, I said something about how, given that I'd spent 22 years teaching geography, navigating a new classroom administration system probably wasn't going to be the most cognitively demanding thing I'd ever done. She looked up from the form. Geography, she said. So you study where people go. And why? I said. And do you know why you came here? I said I'd done the research. She smiled at this, not unkindly, and went back to the form. I filled it in. I came back the following Tuesday for the trial observation, and the Tuesday after that. I started teaching a beginner adult evening class, Tuesdays and Thursdays, 6 to 8. My students were a retired postal worker named Hung, who was learning English to talk to his daughter's husband, a woman called Ingji, who worked in logistics and needed it for international emails, and 4 others in their 20s, who I think were there partly because their parents had made them. They were, all of them, earnest and patient and deeply tolerant of my attempts to explain irregular verbs. I liked them. That surprised me a bit. And there was Lynn, at the front desk. Most evenings when I arrived and when I left. We didn't talk much in those first few weeks. Small professional exchanges. A question about the photocopier. Whether I wanted tea before the class. I noticed things about her the way you notice things about someone you're not allowing yourself to be interested in, incrementally, without decision. One evening, after the second week, she asked if I'd tried the coffee place 2 doors down. I said I hadn't. She said it was good, if I had time. I had time. I had time. We sat on the plastic stools on the pavement, which is where you sit for coffee in this city, with the motorbikes going past 2 feet from your elbow and the smell of roasted beans and the evening heat coming off the concrete. And she asked me, with the directness that I was beginning to understand was just how she spoke. What I thought the biggest misunderstanding Western people had about Vietnam was, I gave her my answer. Post-colonial economic framing, the way the West tends to read Vietnamese development through a lens shaped by the war, rather than engaging with what the country has actually become since. I thought it was a reasonable answer, well-structured. 22 years of classroom delivery behind it. She considered it for a moment. Then she said, politely and without any particular aggression, that she thought I was partially right, but that I was doing the thing I was criticizing, using a theoretical framework to avoid engaging with the specific, and that there was something slightly ironic about a geography teacher explaining Vietnam as an abstraction while sitting in it. I sat with that for a moment. Then I said, "That's fair." And she nodded, as if this was the answer she'd been testing for. Whether I could take a correction from someone who wasn't one of my students. I walked back to the apartment on Nguyen the Si Phu that evening, and at some point between the coffee place and the building, I realized I hadn't thought about Athlone since approximately lunchtime. I didn't make anything of it. I just noted it. Shift in terrain. That night, I rang Kiaran. "I think I've met someone interesting," I said. I wasn't looking for a response. I was just filing the observation out loud. I think now about that phone call sometimes. The data point I entered into the wrong column from the very start. I want to be upfront about something before I describe this period. Because I've watched enough of these videos myself. Yes, I found this channel before I came here, which should tell you something, to know how a certain kind of story gets told. Man meets woman. Man loses money. Woman was the problem. That's not quite what happened. Or rather, it's not the whole of what happened, and I think the incomplete version is actually less useful to you than the complicated one. So I'll try to give you the complicated one. We started spending time together in the way that happens when 2 people who work in the same building keep finding reasons to be in the same corridor. After the coffee that first evening, there was another coffee the following Thursday, then a dinner. A Bumbo Hua place near Hangzhou roundabout that she recommended, about 120,000 dong each, spicy beef noodle soup, that took me 3 visits to be able to finish without my eyes watering. She found this funnier than she let on. I could tell because she would look very carefully at her own bowl at the exact moments when I was struggling. I'm aware of how this reads. 47-year-old divorced Irishman recently arrived in Vietnam, finding a 34-year-old Vietnamese woman charming over a bowl of noodles. One of read the comments sections. I know the version of this story people assume they're hearing. But here's the thing I want you to understand about Lynn. Because it's the thing that made her different from the cautionary tale version I'd been half expecting. She was not particularly interested in flattering me. She didn't tell me I was handsome or young-looking or different from other Western men. She didn't ask about my finances in the first month or the second. What she did do was argue with me, regularly, about things she had actual opinions on, and correct my Vietnamese pronunciation with a patience that was just barely on the right side of condescending, and asked me questions about Ireland with the specific curiosity of someone who is genuinely trying to understand a place rather than someone performing interest. She asked me once, about 3 weeks in, what the west of Ireland actually looked like. Not as a conversational gesture. She wanted to know. I described Roscommon, the flatness of it, the bogs, the particular gray-green of the fields in October. She listened properly. Then she said that Vietnam had a lot of that too, in the north. The same feeling of land that hadn't quite decided what it wanted to be yet. I thought about that for a few days. We went to Lut for a weekend at the end of February, which was her birthday. Her suggestion, I should note, though I paid, which I also note because it becomes relevant to how I account for this period in retrospect. Powell is about 300 kilometers northeast of the city, up in the Central Highlands. Cool air, pine trees, strawberry farms, French colonial architecture left over from when the colonizers used it as a hill station retreat. It costs about 900,000 dong for a bus ticket each way, €33, and accommodation in a decent guest house there runs maybe 500,000 dong a night. So the whole weekend came to roughly €200 between transport and the place and food. I remember entering it in the spreadsheet, under miscellaneous, and then almost immediately feeling slightly odd about having done that. I left it in. It was data. She showed me things about how to look at Vietnam that my Google research had not covered. The way the French influence sits uneasily alongside everything else. The Catholic churches next to the pagodas, the old colonial villas rented out as guest houses. The complicated feelings Vietnamese people have about that history, which don't fit neatly into any framework a Western person brings with them. She told me things about her own family that weekend. Her mother and Bien Jeong, her younger brother Ki, who'd had a motorbike taxi business that had struggled since COVID, her sister Tui in Go Viet, where she was staying. She told me these things conversationally, not as disclosures. Just, this is who I am and where I come from. I listened carefully. I asked what I thought were good questions. She answered them all. I think about that now. The fact that she answered them all. I think about that now. The fact that she answered them all. I took this as a sign of openness, of honesty. And maybe it was. I'm still not entirely sure it wasn't now. I want to talk about a concept, because I think if you're planning to come here and you don't understand this, you'll end up confused about something important. Filial piety. The Vietnamese term is Hio Tho. It's the Confucian principle of obligation to one's parents. Deep, structural, not optional in the way that Western family relationships have become somewhat optional. In Vietnam, if your parents are aging, or sick, or struggling, you support them. Not because you've calculated that you should, but because the alternative is not something the culture has a comfortable space for. If you're the eldest child, or if you're the child with the most resources, you carry a proportionally larger share of this. This isn't manipulation. It isn't even really a choice. It's more like gravity. You can intellectually disagree with it, but it still operates. I knew this. I had, at one point, taught a unit on Confucian social structures as part of a broader East Asian geography module. I had a PowerPoint slide about it. I could explain it to a classroom of teenagers in Roscommon. What I could not do, as it turned out, was feel it coming when it was aimed at me. I should account for the money in this first phase, because the numbers are what this video is partly about, and I committed to being specific. February to end of March, roughly 2,800 in total relationship-related spending. That covers the a locked weekend, 7 or 8 dinners out, usually between 150 and 300,000 dong each at places she chose, which were always good and never expensive. I want to be clear about that. A taxi here and there. A couple of afternoons at the Rue Sim Vien Botanical Garden, which costs about 40,000 dong entry, and which I mentioned because it was one of those afternoons that felt simply like a good afternoon, with no other freight attached to it. And then there was the dress. Dot was in late January that year. I'd already been in the city for it. The whole place transformed, red and gold everywhere. The streets suddenly empty on the actual New Year's Day, in a way that felt almost uncanny after weeks of motorbike density. Lynn had mentioned, once, in passing, maybe 2 weeks before the holiday, not as a request, just as a statement of fact, that she hadn't been able to buy a new ao dai for tea this year. She didn't linger on it. She moved on. I filed it. 3 days later. I asked her if she'd let me get her one. She said no. She couldn't accept that. I said she should let me. She said again that she couldn't. I said I wanted to, and that it wasn't a large thing, and that it would make me happy to do it. She said fine, if I was sure. About 600,000 dong, 22 euro. I thought I was being generous. I thought I had done a kind thing, quietly and without pressure. I understand now that what I had actually done was demonstrate, very clearly and without ambiguity, that I would give before being asked. That the friction of refusal was something I would override with enough light insistence. That the space between her declining and my persisting was a space I would fill. I'm not saying she calculated this, I genuinely don't know. But the outcome was the same either way, and the dress was the first data point in a pattern I didn't have a column for. Towards the end of March, we were sitting in her usual coffee spot, a tiny place tucked into a hum off Chin Tian Huang. The kind where the stools are so low you're practically sitting on the pavement, and the Cafe Shuang. Chin Tian Huang, then is probably advisable. A swan-densed milk then is probably advisable. And she was quieter than usual. I asked if she was all right. She said her mother hadn't been well lately. I asked what was wrong. She said she didn't want to worry me with it. And I said, because I meant it, because I was the kind of person who meant things like this. I told her she could tell me anything. That is, as best I can calculate, the most expensive sentence I spoke in Vietnam. Her mother's name was Ba Luan. I know this because Lin mentioned it once, and I wrote it down. Not for any sinister reason, but because I was in a foreign country, and names I couldn't place phonetically tended to drift away from me if I didn't anchor them. Ba Luan, 63 years old. Living in a terrace house in Bien Duen province, about 40 kilometers north of the city. A kidney condition, one of those managed chronic things, not an emergency, not a crisis, just the ongoing expensive business of being ill in a country without comprehensive public health care. The first conversation about the mother happened over about 20 minutes on a Tuesday evening in late March. We were still at the coffee place in the hum. Lin told me what was wrong, carefully and without drama. The diagnosis, the medication regime, what it cost. The medication alone was running to around 4 million dong a month. That's roughly 150 euro. On a receptionist's salary in a private language school, which I'd guess was somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 million dong a month after tax. That's not nothing. That's a significant percentage. I asked how she'd been managing. She said she'd been managing. That was all she said. She didn't ask me anything. She just answered my question and then changed the subject with a naturalness that, at the time, I interpreted as dignity. Not wanting to make it my problem. I think about that framing now. The way I assigned the interpretation. She didn't ask. Therefore, she wasn't asking. This seemed like a meaningful distinction at the time. The following week, I told her I wanted to help with the medical costs. She said I was asking. She said it wasn't my responsibility. I said I understood that and that I still wanted to help, and that the amount we were talking about was not going to cause me hardship. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, if I was sure. 5 million dong a month. About 185 euro. I transferred it to her account on the last day of March. That was, in retrospect, the second data point after the dress. The pattern of her declining, my insisting, and the thing ultimately happening anyway. 3 weeks later, there was a specialist consultation. The kidney consultant at the private hospital in Bienjingdong was recommending additional tests. The consultation fee and initial tests came to just over 5 million dong. Roughly 190 euro. Lin mentioned this on a Wednesday, not as a request, just as information. I said I'd cover it. She said I didn't have to. I said I wanted to. I'm going to do something slightly uncomfortable now, and read you the list of my rationalizations, because I think they're instructive. I've gone over them enough times that I know them in order. 1. The amounts were individually small. Each transfer, taken alone, was something I could absorb without noticing on a monthly basis. This is true. It's also, I now understand, part of how the architecture works, whether designed or simply evolved. 2. Her mother's condition was probably real. I say probably because I never verified it. I'm going to say that again, I never verified it. I didn't ask to see a diagnosis letter, a prescription, a hospital receipt. I didn't ask because asking would have meant being the kind of man who demands proof of a sick mother, and I was not going to be that man. I was going to be the other kind of man. The generous kind. The kind who gives without interrogation. I want you to understand that this felt, at the time, like a moral position. 3. She had a salary. She was not destitute. She had employment and income and an adult life. I told myself we were sharing the burden. I told myself her own contribution was running in parallel with mine, invisible to me but present. I now think I was the primary solution and her salary was largely untouched, but I don't know this with certainty, and the not knowing is part of why the story doesn't have a clean ending. 4. Filial piety. I understood it. I respected it. I had taught it. A daughter whose mother is ill and whose family has limited resources will move resources from wherever they are available. That is not a character flaw. That is a cultural imperative operating exactly as it's supposed to operate. I was, by the straightforward logic of the situation, the most available resource. Whether this was calculated or simply structural, I've sat with that question for months now. There was a day in early April when I transferred the third payment, the monthly medication contribution for that month, and I sat at my kitchen table in the District 7 apartment, with the laptop open and the transfer confirmation on the screen, and I felt good. I want to be honest about that. Genuinely, cleanly, uncomplicatedly good. The feeling of being useful, of being the person who solves a problem that would otherwise go unsolved. I'd spent 3 years in Roscommon in a condition I can only describe as the opposite of useful, legally extracted from my own house, paying maintenance on a life I was no longer in, present at school every day, doing a job I'd been doing for 2 decades by reflex more than intention. And here I was, in a city I'd chosen, in a relationship that felt real, solving a real problem for a real person. I didn't enter the transfers in the spreadsheet, not separately. I had a category called miscellaneous, which was doing a lot of work by this point, and occasionally I would enter a round figure in it that was slightly vague. I told myself this was because the amounts varied month to month. That was true. It was not the whole truth. In late April, we went to Beendong for a day to visit the mother. This was Lynn's suggestion. I was glad she made it. It felt like an important thing, meeting the person at the center of all this. We took a bus from Beendong Dong Dong, about an hour, and then Exi Meendong, about an hour, and then Exi on to the house from the depot. Bailon was small. I don't know why I'd expected someone larger. She came to the doorway when she heard us, and she looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read. Some combination of curiosity and wariness, and something that might have been gratitude, though directed more at Lynn than at me. She served us cut fruit on a plastic plate, mango and dragon fruit, and something I didn't recognize. The house was clean and modest, a small altar in the corner with incense burning in front of photographs. Her husband, I assumed, and older relatives. The smell of the incense and the fruit and the warm air through the open window. She thanked me, through Lynn's translation. Something about the family being grateful for my kindness. I said it was nothing, it wasn't nothing, but I said it was. I still find that afternoon moving. I want to be clear about this. The mother was real. The house was real. The altar with the incense was real. Whatever else is complicated about this story, that afternoon in Biending was not performed. And this, I think, is why I was still sending the transfers by the end of May, when the total had reached approximately 3,200 across the 2-month period. Because the mother was real. Because her difficulty was real. Because in a country without a functioning public health safety net, the people around a sick person absorbed the cost of that sickness. And Lynn was absorbing it, and I was in the position of being able to reduce the weight of that. All of this was true. It was also true that I had never asked what happened to Lynn's own salary in the months when I was covering the medical expenses. That question arrived later. Arrived on a Reddit thread at 1 a.m., placed there by a stranger who had been in a version of the same situation and had eventually thought to ask it. But that was later. In May, what happened was simpler, Lynn said one evening, that she was embarrassed to keep asking. I told her not to be. She said she didn't want to take advantage of me. I said she wasn't. I meant it. I absolutely meant it. I now recognize it as the moment I removed the only friction that might eventually have slowed things down. By telling her that asking didn't bother me, that she had nothing to be embarrassed about, I had effectively opened a door and then removed the hinges. The living situation was becoming inefficient anyway. That's what I told myself in early May as I began to think about the practical question of what came next. She was still commuting from her sister's place in Groovy Pew, 45 minutes on a good day. She was spending 4 or 5 nights a week at mine. The maths of 2 households was, when examined dispassionately, wasteful. The next step, I told myself, seemed entirely reasonable. I used the word infrastructure. I want to own that. Not in retrospect as a way of being clever about my own stupidity, I actually used it at the time. In a conversation with Sierra on a Sunday evening in late May, when I was explaining why it made practical sense to find a shared apartment, I said the motorbike would be infrastructure. He was quiet for a moment and then said, with the careful tone of a man who has been a friend for long enough to know which hills are worth dying on, "That was an interesting word for long enough to know which hills are worth dying on." I said it was an accurate word for it. We found the apartment in District 3 at the start of June. A friend of Lynn's had a contact, someone's cousin who managed a small residential block on a quiet street off Low Tring, 5 minutes walk from B&A Market. 2 bedrooms, good light, a balcony the size of a large towel, tiled floors that stayed cool in the morning before the heat came through. 18 million dong a month. That's roughly €640, an increase of about €210 on what I'd been paying in District 7. I calculated that Lynn's contribution in reduced transport costs and the time value of her not spending 90 minutes a day commuting offset this increase. I did not write this calculation down. I knew it wouldn't survive contact with an actual spreadsheet. She moved in at the end of June. 4 bags and a box of kitchen things. We bought a few things for the apartment together. A small bookshelf, a kettle that actually worked. She cooked bun ryu on the first Sunday, a crab and tomato noodle soup that took most of the morning and made the whole apartment smell of something I can only describe as specifically Vietnamese, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. I sat at the kitchen table with a bia saigon while she cooked and thought, well, this is something. And it was. That's the thing I need you to understand about this period. Months 6 and 7 were genuinely good. We had a routine. Coffee from the place around the corner on Pasteur Street every morning. They knew our order by week 3, which is a small thing that becomes a surprisingly meaningful one when you've been living in other people's spaces for 3 years. I kept teaching on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She kept working at the school. We'd meet for dinner 2 or 3 evenings a week at a Quan City M on Guan Thao Min Kai that did a pork and mustard greens dish that I ate so frequently, the woman behind the counter would start serving it when she saw me coming. I walked to the market on Saturday mornings. I updated column A. The spreadsheet, for the record, now showed rent at 18 million rather than 12. But everything else was holding. I was eating well, sleeping consistently, not thinking about Athlone. The motorbike, I should account for it. A second-hand Honda SH bought from a dealer near Nguyen, Tri Pung, 42 million dong. Roughly €1,500. I paid for it. Her name went on the registration because foreigners can't register vehicles in Vietnam, which I understood and accepted as a practical reality rather than a decision. It was a one-time cost. Infrastructure, as I have mentioned. I was aware, at a level I wasn't quite examining directly, that the intellectual engagement that had attracted me to Lynn was slowly being replaced by something more domestic and less sparky. Our conversations in month 7 were less likely to involve her correcting my assumptions about post-colonial economic frameworks, and more likely to involve who's picking up the rice. This is normal relationship gravity, I told myself. All couples go through this. The first phase of intellectual electricity doesn't sustain. What replaces it is a different kind of closeness. I believe this. I still think it contains some truth. But the particular thing that had made her feel different from everyone I'd expected to meet here was the quality of her argument, and its gradual disappearance left a space I didn't know what to do with, and I filed this observation without acting on it, which is a habit of mine apparently. Then August. And the brother. Kaushwai. I'd heard about him, the motorbike taxi business, the COVID collapse, the debts that had accumulated in the years since. Lynn had mentioned him in Fegloot back in February, briefly, as part of the family inventory she'd offered without being asked. I hadn't thought about him much since. He existed in my understanding of Lynn's life, the way a background feature exists on a map, noted, categorized, not currently relevant. He became relevant on a Wednesday evening when Lynn told me, quietly and with what I read as genuine distress, that he was at risk of defaulting on a loan. The lender was not a bank. It was the kind of lender that exists in the gap between what banks will offer and what people in desperate situations need, and the consequences of default in that context are not primarily financial. The amount, 85 million dong, just over 3,000 euro. I didn't say yes immediately. I want to be precise about this because it's the part one still feels some ambivalence about. I did not simply hand over the money. I asked questions over 2 evenings. I asked what the loan was originally for. I asked what the business had been and what had happened to it. I asked about the lender. She answered all of it. I made notes. And then I opened a new tab in Excel and built a small risk assessment table. 2 columns. Left side, reasons this was a reasonable thing to do. Right side, reasons it wasn't. I populated both. The left side included genuine hardship, family stability, one-time cost, the concept of face, the Dion, which in Vietnamese culture makes a debt default not merely a financial event, but a social one that affects the whole family's standing. The right side included no formal repayment terms, no security, the pattern of previous transfers, the fact that I was funding this from my dead mother's life insurance. I looked at the table for a while, then I transferred the money. I'm aware, with the particular self-disgust available only to someone who spent 22 years teaching critical thinking, that I had built an Excel model for the sole purpose of persuading myself to do something I'd already decided to do. The table was not analysis. It was documentation of a foregone conclusion. A geography teacher should know the difference between a map and a territory. 3 days later, Lynn showed me a voice message on Zalo from Kai. She played it and then translated. He says thank you. He will repay when he can. No date, no amount, no schedule. I didn't ask for one. The relationship I was protecting felt, at that moment, worth more than the absence of a repayment plan. I believed at that moment that this was true. Kai has not repayment plan. I don't expect him to. That night, I opened the spreadsheet. I looked at column B for a long time. Then I closed the laptop without entering anything. I'd never done that before. Not once since January, not through the apartment upgrade, not through the medical transfers, not through the Honda SH. I had always entered something, even when the something was a vague figure in a category called miscellaneous, that was quietly carrying most of the weight. That night I didn't, because entering it would have made it a number, and making it a number would have required me to add it to all the other numbers, and adding all the numbers together would have required a conversation I wasn't ready to have. About what I'd spent, and why, and whether the reasons were real. She said something to me that evening, after I put the laptop away. She said the family would always remember what I'd done for them. I believe this is probably true. I just didn't understand, at the time, that being remembered was a different thing from being repaid, and that in the economy we were actually operating in, memory was the currency on offer, and I'd been confusing it for something else. I stopped updating column B. August turned into the second week of August, and the apartment was warm and familiar, and I was sleeping reasonably well, and the relationship had a different weight than it had 6 months ago. But I couldn't say precisely what the weight was or what it meant. One Tuesday at 1 in the morning, I couldn't sleep. I picked up my phone. I opened Reddit. I typed, Vietnam girlfriend family obligations, how much is normal? It wasn't a crisis night. I want to be clear about that. There was no argument, no particular incident, nothing that had happened that day to precipitate it. Lynn was asleep in the other room. The apartment was quiet except for the distant sound of a Xiam somewhere on Li Ti Tring and, faintly, a television from the floor above. I was lying on the couch with my phone because I'd been awake for an hour and the ceiling wasn't providing anything useful. The search returned about 40 million results. I read the first thread for 20 minutes before clicking through to a second one, and then a third, and then a long post on an expat forum that someone had written in 2023 and that had accumulated 312 replies over 2 years. I read most of them. I'm going to try to describe what I found without converting it into evidence against Lynn, because I think converting it into evidence would be too easy and would also be, in some ways, a distortion. What the threads contained was not proof of anything. What they contained was a pattern, and the pattern was familiar in the way that a medical diagram is familiar when you've been experiencing the symptoms for months without a name for them. The structure was always the same. Foreigner arrives, meets woman. Relationship feels genuine, and in many cases, is genuine. Family obligations emerge gradually, never all at once, always in individually manageable increments. Medical costs, a business problem, a sibling's education, a parent's situation. Each ask preceded by visible reluctance, followed by visible relief when the foreigner steps in. The foreigner's relative wealth, which can be quite modest by Western standards, a pension, and some savings, makes him, in the local economic context, the most available solution to every problem that arises. He starts to function less as a partner and more as a financial instrument. The relationship eventually collapses under the weight of this, or he leaves, or both. The commenters ranged from the genuinely bitter, several of whom had lost amounts that made my total look minor, to the measured and analytical, to a few who had navigated it successfully, by establishing clear financial limits very early, which is advice that is considerably more useful before the event than after it. The comment I've been turning over since was not from a bitter person. It was from someone who wrote calmly and at some length, and the relevant sentence was, "It doesn't matter whether she planned it or not. The outcome is the same." I sat with that for a while. I still sit with it. It's the most honest sentence I've read about the situation I was in, and it's honest precisely because it doesn't answer the question I actually wanted answered. Whether Lynn had calculated any of this, whether the reluctance was performed, whether she had seen a Thai arrive at a language school reception desk in January and assessed the situation and begun, consciously and deliberately, to position me. I don't know. I genuinely don't know. And the comment was right that it doesn't change the number, but it changes something. Not what happened, but how you carry it. I didn't search her name. I didn't search her name. I didn't look at her phone, which was on the kitchen table. I didn't contact anyone. I just closed Reddit, opened the calculator app, and did the addition for the first time with full honesty. Early relationship spending, points 800. Medical contributions, Thai 3,200. Apartment upgrade differential and the Honda SHP S2300. The brothers' loan, Thai 3,000. General lifestyle inflation. The cost of simply living at a higher level than I would have alone. The dinners out, and the spontaneous taxis, and the things that accumulate when two people share a space, and one of them pays for most of it. Roughly 3,500, which surprised me most because I had no single identifiable transaction, and yet was somehow the largest invisible item on a budget I'd thought I was maintaining, against a budget that had projected €8,200 for the same period. The difference, €6,600, and nearly all of it had gone to her family. I looked at that number for a while. Then I put the phone down and looked at the ceiling again and thought about my mother's money sitting in the credit union in Roscommon for 2 years, because spending it felt like a conversation I wasn't ready to have. And here I'd had the conversation, apparently, in increments, without ever quite deciding to. The following week I prepared for the conversation the way I'd prepare for a difficult class. I thought about what I wanted to say. I thought about the likely responses and how I would handle them. I chose a Sunday morning because Sunday mornings in the apartment were generally quiet, and neither of us had anywhere to be. I told her, carefully and without accusation, that I needed to stop being the financial solution for her family's problems, that I cared about her, and that nothing I was saying was intended as a criticism of her family or of the obligations she felt toward them, but that the pattern of the previous months was not something I could continue, and that I should have said so earlier, and that I was saying so now. She was quiet for a moment. Then she cried. And I believe the tears. I want to put that on record. I believe them because they didn't look like the tears of someone who had been caught. They looked like the tears of someone who was sad, about the situation, about what it had revealed, about what was ending maybe. I don't know exactly what she was sad about, but the sadness seemed real. She said, "I know it's not fair." Not, "I didn't know it was happening." Not, "I don't understand what you mean." "I know it's not fair." That's the closest thing I have to an answer about whether any of it was conscious. It's not close enough for a verdict. But it's what she said, and I noted it, because I note things. She said she was sorry. She said she understood. She didn't say it wouldn't happen again, and I think I respected her for that, because it would have been a promise she couldn't honestly keep. Her mother's condition wasn't going to improve. Her brother's condition wasn't going to improve. Her brother's situation wasn't resolved. The family's financial pressures weren't going to disappear, because I'd established a boundary, and if we continued, those pressures would continue to find their way toward me, unless I maintained that boundary consistently. And maintaining it consistently would have required me to become a different kind of person in the relationship than I'd been. And neither of us really acknowledged that. The relationship continued for 6 more weeks. We were civil. Kind, even, in the way that people can be kind to each other, when they're both aware that something is ending and neither of them wants to be the one to name it. The intellectual engagement didn't return. The warmth became careful. We ate dinner together several evenings a week, and the conversations were fine. And I missed, I realized, not her specifically, or not only her, but the version of the relationship that had existed in the first 3 months, before the wait arrived. No further financial requests came. I don't know whether this was because of what I'd said, or because there was nothing left to ask for at that particular moment. I never found out. In late September, I booked a flight. I didn't tell her I was leaving for good. I said I needed a trip, a recalibration, which is the word I used and which she received with a nod that suggested she understood the word I actually meant. I packed the apartment over 2 days. I returned the key to the landlord's cousin. I said goodbye to Lynn in the hallway on a Thursday morning. I don't know what the right thing to say was. I believe the sadness was real. None of those things make the total any different. I booked a grab to Tan Son Nhat. The driver had a small Buddha on the dashboard and a phone mount playing Vietnamese pop at low volume. The city went past the window, the way it had on the first morning in January. The same motorbikes, the same tangled wires, the same logic of water density that I'd spent nearly a year learning to move through. I cried once, briefly, somewhere on the elevated section of the highway before the airport approach, not dramatically. Just, the thing released itself without much warning, the way it sometimes does when you've been holding it correctly for a long time. I sat with it for a minute and then it stopped. It was the first time I'd cried since the solicitor's office in 2022. I'm not sure what to make of that. I've thought about it. I don't have a satisfying conclusion. It's just a fact I carry around with me now. At the airport, I sat in the departures hall for an hour before my gate opened. I bought a café sauve from a stand near the check-in area, 15,000 dong, the same as it had been on day 1. I opened my laptop. I created a new file. I typed 2 words in the header. District 4. I didn't go home. I want to acknowledge that this might seem strange. Most people in this situation, man has difficult experience, loses significant money, cries in a taxi, would go home. I had a home to go to, technically. Cormac and Aoife are in Athlone. Ciaran is in Galway. Ireland exists and has not moved. But I sat at the gate at Tan Son Nhat and looked at the departure board and booked a connecting flight to somewhere that was not Dublin. District 4. If you're not familiar with it, it's a short grab ride from District 1, across the Ken T Canal. Less expat heavy than Teogene or BNTN, less tourist heavy than District 1. Narrower streets, proper hum alleys, a morning market on TNTTT that operates at a volume and tempo that makes sleeping past 6:30 essentially aspirational. I found a 1-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a family building. Landlord lives on the ground floor. His mother on the 2nd, me on the 3rd. 14.2 million dong a month, all bills included. Roughly €510. Quieter than District 3, better landlord, and no association with anything that had happened in the previous 11 months. I updated the spreadsheet. Since this video is called what it's called, let me give you the actual numbers. The honest ones, not the YouTube ones. Rent in District 4, Decent, one bedroom, 14 million dong, about 510 euro. Food. Breakfast is a banh mi from the cart on the corner, 25,000 dong. Lunch is usually combi anew dan from the place on Hong Diu, around 50,000 dong. Dinner. I cook maybe 3 nights a week and eat out the rest at around 80 to 100,000 dong a plate. Food total per month, around 5 million dong, roughly 185 euro. Transport. I still don't own a motorbike. I use Grab. I still don't own a motorbike. I use Grab. I walk. Occasionally I hire a Axiom for longer distances. About 1.5 million dong a month. Healthcare. I have travel insurance that covers outpatient, and I use FV Hospital on Nguyen Lung Brung when I need it, which so far has been twice, once for a minor chest infection, once for a dental thing. The dental thing cost 2 million dong and was frankly better than anything I'd accessed in Roscommon for 3 times the price. Visa situation, since people always ask, Irish passport holders get a 90-day e-visa, single entry, renewable, but you have to leave and re-enter each time. I do a visa run every 90 days. Phnom Penh is the easiest, overnight bus from Myeongdong Station, 1 night in a guest house, back on the bus the next morning. Costs about 150 euro all in, including the new Vietnam e-visa fee. Roughly 600 euro a year in visa costs, which is a real number that almost nobody puts in their cost of living videos because it's annoying to account for. There's also the question of teaching. I kept 2 evening classes at a different school, not Apollo, a smaller place in District 4 that was glad to have a native speaker with 2 decades of classroom experience. The work permit situation for teaching is technically complicated. You're supposed to have a work permit, a teaching certificate, your qualifications authenticated by the Vietnamese embassy, which is a process so laborious it deserves its own video. I have a TEFL certificate I got online in 3 weeks, which puts me in the same situation as most foreigners teaching here. Technically in a gray area, practically tolerated, 1 inspection away from a problem. I mention this because if you're planning to teach here, you should know it. I'm not endorsing the gray area, I'm just describing it. My current monthly total, all in, 14.2 million dong, about 510 euro a month. Add the visa runs, and you're at roughly 560 euro averaged across the year. My pension covers that comfortably, with money left over. I have the remainder of my mother's insurance money, now reduced to approximately 63,200 euro, sitting in the credit union. I intend to be more deliberate about how I spend the rest of it. Now, the second accounting, the one that doesn't appear in the YouTube videos, and also didn't appear in my spreadsheet because I didn't have a column for it. 14,800 euro. That's what I lost over 11 months in the company of Lynn and her family. I've broken it down already, and the categories are as I described them. And I don't want to dwell on them again because I think dwelling on the categories is a way of avoiding the more interesting question, which is, why did I spend it? And the answer is not that I was tricked, or not only that. The answer is that I arrived in Vietnam carrying a specific kind of hunger that I hadn't declared, the way you sometimes don't declare things at customs because you're not entirely sure they're subject to tax. I was hungry to be needed, to be the solution to a solvable problem, to be the man who fixed things in a life where the things that had broken, my marriage, my sense of the future, my mother's ongoing existence, were not things I'd been able to fix. Lynn gave me a place to put that hunger, and I filled it. Generously, willingly, in increments, until the number reached 14,800 euro and the relationship had changed shape, and I was sitting on a couch at 1 in the morning reading Reddit and recognizing every stage. Was she a bad person? I've been asked this. People want a verdict. The verdict I can offer is, I don't know. She was a person navigating genuine family obligations in a culture where those obligations are real and structural and not optional, in a country where the public healthcare system is inadequate and a receptionist's salary doesn't go far enough, in a situation where a Western man with a pension and a lump sum had made himself available and had repeatedly, explicitly declined to limit that availability. Whether she saw that and acted on it deliberately, I don't know. Whether she simply lived inside it, the way water finds gaps without it ever quite becoming a decision, I also don't know. The absence of a villain doesn't make the loss smaller, but it does make it different to carry. What I missed in the accounting was myself, the loneliness I'd arrived with, the particular need of a man who had spent 3 years feeling excised from his own life. Those things cost money too. They cost 14,800 euro in my case, and they probably would have cost something in any country I'd gone to, because I'd have brought them with me. Vietnam just happened to have a very efficient mechanism for finding them. I'm still here. I have a coffee place on 1 Bien Bien where they know my order, a café soir, and whatever ban bien is fresh that morning. I sit there on Saturday mornings with my laptop, sometimes grading things for the school, sometimes just watching the street, the motorbikes, the woman with the cart selling bien bien from a pot on a gas ring, the old man who parks his Honda Dream in the same spot every morning and does what appears to be Tai Chi, but might be something more personal. I call Siad on Sundays. He asks how I'm getting on. I say I'm grand. And the difference now is that it's incrementally closer to being true. I think my mother would have found this entire sequence of events completely predictable and quietly funny. She was a woman with a clear view of her son's capacity for self-deception, which she mostly expressed through pointed silences and a slight tightening around the eyes. I spent her money on an adventure that didn't go to plan, in a country she probably hadn't heard much about, for reasons that made sense to me at the time. I think she'd find that appropriate. Not ideal, but appropriate. I'm starting to be all right with that. The lesson, and I'll give it to you plainly because that's how I give lessons, is this: I budgeted for Vietnam. I did not budget for myself, and it turns out that's the more expensive item. The thing I miss most is not Lynn, or not only Lynn. It's the version of myself that existed in the first 3 months of knowing her, before the financial weight arrived. That version felt, for the first time in years, like someone who was moving towards something rather than managing the aftermath of something. Someone with a future tense rather than an ongoing present of complicated paperwork. I pause here because I want to be accurate. That's the part 1,000 still trying to get back. And I think I'm making progress, slowly. On a third-floor apartment in District 4, with a spreadsheet that is, for the first time in a long time, entirely accurate. Column A, column B. They match. That's enough for now. That's enough. That's Declan Murtagh. Thank you, Declan, for trusting us with this. Here at Inside Vietnam, we told stories of total loss and calculated betrayal. Men who arrived with savings and left with nothing, chased by people who never intended them any good. Declan's story is different and in some ways harder to sit with, because there's no clean target for the anger. A sick mother in Bien du Chong, a brother with a loan default, a woman who cried real tears and said, "I know it's not fair," instead of, "I didn't know." These things don't resolve instead of, "I didn't know." These things don't resolve into is this: Vietnam is genuinely, affordably livable. The numbers Declan cited for his life in District 4, roughly 500 euro a month, all in, with the visa costs added, are accurate and achievable. The cost of living here is real, and it is low, and it is not the problem. The problem, if you're planning to come, if you're watching this at 11 p.m. in a rented room somewhere in the English-speaking world and building your own spreadsheet, is the thing you pack without knowing you've packed it. The loneliness, the need, the particular hunger of a man who has been handed back his own life and doesn't quite know what to do with it. Vietnam will meet that hunger. It has efficient mechanisms. It has warmth and chaos and excellent coffee and genuine human connection, and also a set of cultural dynamics around family and money and obligation that a Western man can misread very badly even when he's done his research. Come informed not just about Dongto euro exchange rates and visa runs and which district has the best CMTM. Come informed about what you're carrying. Come knowing the gap between what you're running from and what you're hoping to find. Because Vietnam is a real place, not a projection screen, and it will take the shape of whatever you pour into it. We're inside Vietnam. If Declan's story helped you, or if it stung a little in a way that felt familiar, leave a comment. He reads them. Take care of yourselves. We'll see you next time.